All right, I'm going to tell you straight up that you will be absolutely frustrated tonight because we are going to take a look at two chapters in Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39. It might be the more intriguing chapters for you because it's been used a lot in previous decades to justify a certain outlook on eschatology and end time predictions. But it's very frustrating section of the book because we don't know exactly what it's referring to, but I'll try to build a case for it being uh, kind of a parenthetical chapter that's built upon what we had already seen before, the oracles against the nations that were listed back in chapter 28. And it's also kind of proto-apocalyptic in the sense that whatever awaits the nation of Israel in the future, God has his hand on the wheel and is going to protect the nation. So we'll get to that in a second. I want to show you first, this is where we are in our study. And you're going to notice here that in chapters 38 and 39, it's a part of the final section of the book where the central idea is God's final victory over evil among the nations, a plurality of nations. And then chapters 40 through 48, which we'll take that as a big chunk next Wednesday night to finish off this study. Now, why are we taking so many chapters next week? It's talking about a new temple, but it's a lot of measurements and a lot of genealogies in that final section. So we'll explain that next week. But we're going to come to a conclusion of this study next week. But we're going to take a look at chapters 38 and 39. Now, when I started this study, I showed you video number 1 from the Bible Project that summarized the first half of the book. I'd like to begin tonight with video number 2, and part 2 deals with the second half of the book. So it will kind of remind you where this has gone and where we're sitting as we look at these couple of chapters for a few moments. Let's watch.
The book of the prophet Ezekiel. In the first video, we were introduced to Ezekiel the priest, and he's sitting among the exiles in Babylon. And he's confronted by the awesome glory of God's temple presence, but it's appearing to him in Babylon. And then Ezekiel discovers why. It's because of Israel's idolatry and injustice that has compelled God to abandon his own temple. And while there is still hope for the future, the book went on to develop Ezekiel's message of divine judgment, first for Israel and then for the nations around Israel. And then a key moment happened in chapter 33. Ezekiel receives a report that the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem is over because the city has fallen. The temple is destroyed. Ezekiel's grim words of warning came true. The exile was the most horrendous catastrophe that ever happened to Israel, and it raised the big questions of whether God was done with Israel for good. But remember, at the end of chapter 11, God promised that there was still a future beyond exile for Israel. And so the rest of the book is designed to explore Ezekiel's vision of hope, first for Israel, then for the nations, and then for all of creation. The hope for Israel begins with God promising to raise up a new David, a future messianic king, who's going to be the kind of leader that Israel needed but never got. And this new Israel, who's going to come under the messianic king's rule, is going to be a transformed people. God's going to deal with the heart of their problem of rebellion by giving them new hearts. It's just like Moses promised at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. God says he's going to remove their hard hearts and send his spirit into his people to give them new, soft hearts that can love and obey their God. And this idea gets developed in the next strange vision. Ezekiel sees a huge valley filled up with dry human bones and skeletons, and God tells him that it's an image, a metaphor for Israel's spiritual state. So their rebellion against God, it resulted in exile and the literal death of many people, but it was also a metaphorical death of their covenant relationship. And God tells Ezekiel that his spirit is coming to bring his people back to life. And so this wind comes, and it causes all of the bones to stand up, and it fills them with breath and life, and then skin grows over the bones, and then all of a sudden Ezekiel sees all of these new humans standing in front of him. Now, this vision, it's recalling the story about the creation of humans in Genesis chapter 2, where God made humans out of dirt and divine breath. And so Israel and all humanity have rebelled, resulting in death. And so the only hope is that God would perform a new act of creation and remake humans in such a way that they can truly live in a relationship of love with God and with each other. And so after God is going to deal with the evil that's in the hearts of his own people, some questions still remain unresolved. Like, what about the evil that's still rampant out there among the nations? And what about the future of God's dwelling place in the temple? And this is what the final two sections of the book are about. So first come chapters 38 and 39, and they promise God's final defeat of evil among the nations, which gets personified by a ruler who's named Gog from the land of Magog. Now, this name is derived from a genealogy of ancient kingdoms and lands from Genesis chapter 10, and it referred to powerful nations from the distant past. And so Ezekiel picks up this ancient biblical name as an image of any and all violent kingdoms. And so we find that Gog gets allied with 7 nations that come from all 4 directions of the compass, is clearly an image that represents all of the nations. And this also helps us understand why Ezekiel describes Gog with images that he used earlier in the book to describe the king of Tyre and the king of Egypt, Pharaoh. For Ezekiel, Gog is an amalgam of all of the worst, most violent people in the Bible. Gog is the archetype of human rebellion against God. The basic story in these chapters is that Gog resists God's plan to restore his people. And so just like Pharaoh in the Exodus story, Gog comes to destroy the people. But God unleashes his justice on Gog, and it's in a flurry of scenes that don't actually make very good literal sense if you read them in sequence. Because first, Gog and his armies are consumed by an earthquake, but then they're consumed by fire 2 different times, and then after that, God comes and strikes Gog and his army down in the fields where they lay unburied for months. It's clear that these scenes are full of symbol and imagery. Ezekiel has pulled out his entire poetic tool set here to describe how God is determined to finally defeat human evil that has ruined his world. And it's so that he can pave the way for a new creation. And so once evil is finally dealt with among the nations, the last section of the book describes how God's presence is going to one day return to his people and his temple to bring cosmic restoration. So Ezekiel first gets this long, elaborate vision of a new temple and a new city. He's given this heavenly tour guide who shows him around the new temple complex, and it's much larger and more majestic than even Solomon's temple. There's a new altar, new priests, a whole new system of worship. And then after this elaborate tour, God's glorious throne chariot that he saw back in his first vision comes back, and it enters the new temple. Now, the meaning of these temple visions has been the source of debate for a long, long time. So some Christian and Jewish readers believe that this vision will be fulfilled literally one day, and that these chapters offer the actual blueprints of the new temple that will be built when the Messiah returns and brings God's kingdom. But many other Jewish and Christian readers think that this vision, like all of Ezekiel's other visions, is full of symbols, and they depict the reality of God's presence returning to his people in the Messianic kingdom, but not necessarily in the form of an actual building. Whichever view you take, it's important that Ezekiel never calls the city Jerusalem, and chapters 47 and 48 show why. Ezekiel sees this tiny stream pouring out of the temple threshold and steps, and then it quickly becomes this raging river, and then it flows out of the temple and the city into the desert, into one of the most desolate places on planet Earth, the Dead Sea Valley. And then that river, it leaves behind it a trail of trees and life, and then the Dead Sea gets transformed into a living sea that's teeming with plants and animals. All of this imagery comes from the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And we see just how cosmic Ezekiel's vision really is. God's plan has always been to restore all humanity and all creation back to his life-giving presence. And so the book ends with the name of this garden city. The Lord is there. And so Ezekiel's visions come to a close, full of hope for a new future, new humans living in a new world that's animated by God's life-giving spirit. It's a world permeated with God's love and justice. And that's what the book of Ezekiel is all about.
Okay, so we're going to take a look a little bit closer at chapters 38 and 39. So if you have a Bible in front of you, we'll pull out a few verses and illustrate what Tim Mackey was showing us by means of video. So here's what I want you to look for as we take a look at this text. Number one, Gog represents an opposition to the purposes of God, especially as it relates to the nation of Israel. And I really do think Gog is one of those figurative type of expressions, a literary character, if you will, that is going to be illustrative of all evil nations and what they tend to do toward their enemies. Number two, God is setting out to bring a blessing to the whole world, and he must confront the influence of the snake, if that's the image you want to use out of Genesis chapter 3, or as we said in our most recent Sunday morning service, the chaos dragon, the serpent that brings about chaos through the disorder and violence in the world. Number three, ancestry doesn't necessarily determine who we are before God. It's not just our ethnicity. How we respond to God is determinative of our relationship with Him. And then number four, Ezekiel's oracle imagines that God is going to deal with evil in the world prior to setting up His kingdom. So, with that in mind, basically chapters 38 and 39 is talking about Yahweh's victory over evil. And it's done in two ways: the restoration of Israel as God's covenant people, and then the restoration of God's own reputation among the nations. So we're going to point that out in a couple of moments here, that one of the reasons that God is going to come against those that are aggressive against the nation of Israel is not only to preserve them, but to preserve his image and his character in the eyes of the nation. So, what we'll see is that at first, here in chapters 38 and 39, here's where I think it pertains to the Gog and Magog in these two chapters, is that it's done in reverse order. So God is primarily envisioning this as a way of uh, improving his reputation among the nations. Now, the Gog of Magog oracles, as it states here, if you take a look at verse 1, chapter 38, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. This is what the prophet, sovereign Lord says: I'm against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. So let's stop there for a moment. So this is very much like the oracles against the nations that you see in this highlighted area, Ezekiel chapter 28. And in chapter 28, we looked at some of those oracles against the nations, but we're given a reason here. If you listen to these two verses in chapter 28, verses 25 and 26, it says, This is what the sovereign Lord says: When I gather the people of Israel from the nations where they have been scattered, I will show myself holy among them in sight of the nations. So this has something to do with his reputation among the nations. Then they will live in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob. They will live there in safety and will build houses and plant vineyards, and they will live in safety when I inflict punishment on all their neighbors who malign them. So the judgment has something to do with not only maligning the nation of Israel, but maligning the character of God as well. And so this oracle that's in chapter 28 and 20, chapter 38 and 39 is very similar to chapter 28 because it has kind of the same purpose. So the way to reflect upon this is if you look at chapter 38 and chapter 39, they're parallel. So I'm just going to read this. I'm not going to read the text. You can do that on your own. So it's almost as if there's two takes that's going on and it's saying the same thing. So in chapter 38, Gog and his army is summoned by Yahweh to the mountains of Israel. Then over in 39, 1 through 8, Gog and his army are summoned and defeated by Yahweh on the mountains of Israel. Then you come back to chapter 38. What is Gog's motive? To get plunder. In chapter 39, Gog's remains are burned and plunder themselves, and it's then buried. Chapter 38, Gog and his army are summoned by God so that the nations acknowledge God or Yahweh. Chapter 39, Gog's remains are consumed in a sacrificial feast. That's part of the fire that the video is talking about. And then chapter 38, there's a fourfold defeat of Gog by sword, plague, flood, and fire. Chapter 39, God is acknowledged among Israel and the nations when he defeats Gog and he restores Israel to her land. So now the big question here, what is this talking about? Who is Gog? Is it a historical figure or is it a literary figure? And how that's answered depends upon who you've been most influenced by in your view of eschatology and what type of church you attended. So, if you attended a church that's very literal in its hermeneutic, it'll try to say that this is a future that is still coming that sets up some type of Armageddon battle that's going to take place at the end of time. If you take this to be symbolic, it's kind of building upon the previous motive to show God has not forgotten his people and that he will come to their aid when they need it. So, where do we get this idea of Gog? Well, I think you see bits and pieces and parts of it in the stories that lead up to the prophets. So let's remind ourselves a little bit of that. When you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, you have a deceptive serpent, obviously, and it's mentioned that one of the curses is perpetual hostility between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, humanity, and this spiritual influence. Then this hostility gets into the lineage of Adam and Eve's three sons, Cain, Abel, and Seth. So we know the story of Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel, but God provides a replacement son in Seth. But this same perpetual conflict is taking place. Then when you come to Genesis 4, Cain, being consumed by the power of sin, as he is compelled to murder the seed of the woman in his brother Abel, then begins to find himself leading a influence of revenge. So when you get to Genesis chapter 4, we're told that he founds a city of blood. And this is part of a lineage in Genesis 4 called Tubal Cain. Okay, Tubal Cain. And God restarts with Seth, sort of like he does with Noah. And the story fast forwards to the time of Noah. And what you have is violence is consuming the land, and God is going to start all over with the new Adam figure in Noah. But Noah, likewise, like Adam and Eve, have three sons. And these three sons are mentioned in Genesis chapter 10. And what's interesting there is um, God talks about one of those sons having their territory enlarged. So I'm going to read just a section out of Genesis chapter 10 for a moment. In Genesis chapter 10, you have one of those sections that you're introduced to the names of some people that at the time of reading it, you think, oh, this doesn't have anything to do with anything. I can just skip over this. But when you pay attention to it, you're introduced to something that pops up later. So it says here in Genesis 10, this is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. The sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madi, Javan, Tubal, and we were going to see Tubal Cain from chapter 4, Meshach and Tyrus, and then you have the sons of Gomer and the sons of Javan are listed there. And then you have listed under the sons of Ham, you have Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. And then the sons of Cush are named there as well. Now, okay, these genealogies don't mean a whole lot to us, but it did to those in the ancient Near East. They kind of carried these names forward with them and almost become embodiments of what they're like. So if you look at the middle of the slide here, the enlarging of Japheth invites the reader to kind of keep in mind his descendants. And what Noah is going to anticipate is the enlarging of nations and territory that will eventually come into conflict with the other sons of Noah as well. You take all that, you fast forward to Genesis 14, Numbers 24, Daniel 7 through 12. These different veins, if you will, all kind of come together that are in constant conflict and war with each other. And that, I think, comes to a head in Ezekiel chapter 38, and it's kind of embodied in this word Gog. So the name Gog is derived from the Table of Nations in Genesis 10:2, where the sons of Japheth, they're located to the north and the western Mediterranean territories. And what scholars are attempting to get at when they begin to look at the history of the ancient Near East is when the name Gog shows up, is it referring to something still to come, or is it alluding to something from the past? Now, some scholars think that the title Gog is rooted in an actual historical figure, a guy by the name of Gugu, or Gyges, who's the king of Lydia. Now, that doesn't mean anything to us, but in the 7th to early 6th century BCE, while they were never a threat initially to the nation of Israel and their tribes, they do represent one of the first ancient superpowers. Now, you have Assyria, you have Babylon, Egypt, and so forth that have already been mentioned in the book but of Ezekiel. But now you take this archetype and God becomes kind of symbolic of all nations that come against his people. And in the Old Testament, that is primarily the nation of Israel as recorded in the covenants and so forth. So, what are we doing with this? Well, by the time you come to Ezekiel, let's go back to chapter 38 now. You have 7 nations that are identified as allies of Gog, the ones that are pushing against the nation of Israel. And I'll show them to you here. It says in verse 3, this is what the sovereign Lord says: I'm against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. There are 2 names, okay? And then it says, I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and bring you out with your whole army, your horses, your horsemen fully armored, and a great horde with a large and small shields, all of them brandishing their swords. Persia, number 3, Cush, number 4, and Put will be with them, number 5, all with shields and helmets. Gomer, number 6, with all its troops, and Beth Togarma from the far north. There's number 7. So 7 nations are singled out here. Reminds us of the oracles of the nations that listed 7 nations earlier in chapter 28, of which was Moab and Edom and Egypt and those type of things. So what is going on here? Gog, it seems to me, seems to be a summary word that is reflecting 4 geographical directions and is summarizing all of the intricate conflicts that are taking place in this area of the world during the time of the ancient Near East. So maybe what Ezekiel's trying to get at here is this last line on the slide. Maybe this is suggesting that the whole world seems to be against Israel, but God will not forget his people. Okay. So if you look at the different directions, you have an area of modern Turkey, Persia, you have Ethiopia and Libya. And then when you look to the west, Gomer and far northwest will take you up into the territory close to the Ukraine. Now, when you look at these couple of chapters, I want you to rewind in your mind. And back in the 70s, I've talked about this often. There was an obsession with end time prophecy. And what we find is that it was all over the place, not only in written material, but I hope some of you remember there was a guy by the name of Jack Van Impe on TV. Jack Van Impe and his lovely wife, Roxella, or something like that, if I remember correctly. The guy was amazing. He had a photographic memory. He really did. And he could quote scripture from all over the place. But I think his interpretive lens to take everything literal and not look for the symbolic behind it took him to the edges of saying, ah, chapter 38 and chapter 39 of Ezekiel is all about the day of that final battle when God will pull Russia down into Israel and attack her, and God will intervene. Look at verse 7 of chapter 38. Get ready, be prepared, you and all the hordes gathered around you, and take command of them. After many days, you will be called to arms. So a dispensational lens of interpretation says, oh, it says right here, after many days, somewhere in the future, because it says right here, in future years, you will invade a land that has recovered from war. Ah, this must be Israel. It must be the end times. It must be Armageddon, whose people were gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. So there's an immediate conclusion that this is talking about something yet to come. And with that, it was they look at this text, and we'll see in this text here in verse 1 of chapter 39, it says, Son of man, prophesy against Gog. This is what the sovereign Lord says, I'm against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Now, your footnotes, if you have a New International Bible translation, it says, or Gog, the prince of Rosh, Rosh. I don't know if you see that at the bottom of your text. So New International Version is doing more than translating, it's doing interpreting. And it's supplying this statement, Prince of Rosh, which sounds like Russia. That's the mentality that went on back in the 70s. See, it's right there. Russia is named. No, it's not. Okay.
Oh.
Okay. No, it's not. That's not anywhere near right. But that's how this text was being manipulated at the time. So it seems to me that the main theological concern of this chapter is God is going to deal with evil and rebellion, not only, as we saw in the video, among his own people, but the nations as well. And what he wants to do is bring about a new creation. That's chapters 40 to the end of the book that we'll see next week. That that is pictured symbolically in a new temple. Now, when you take this literal and then you say, okay, the temple's been destroyed, when is Jesus coming again? Well, and you've heard this through a lot of messianic Jewish things. Well, we'll know that Jesus' return is close when we see Israel starting to build a new temple. You've heard of that, right? So, um, this, I think, is kind of going against what Ezekiel's trying to do here. Remember, Tim Mackey said in the video, Ezekiel's pulling out every literary tool in his toolbox here, and he's trying to communicate in a powerful way. The identity of Gog has eluded exegetes for centuries. And it seems as though this seems to be addressing a gap between what is current exile and what will be coming back to their land after Babylonian exile. And what we find is that Ezekiel is using the vision as a way of bringing hope and re energizing the people. Because if we fast forward to Nehemiah and Ezra, after Babylon is defeated by Medo Persia, what we find is that Cyrus allows the people to go back, but it's only a small remnant that goes back to the land and does the hard work of rebuilding the city and rebuilding the temple. Most stayed behind in Babylon. They had already settled in there and had a family and found husbands and wives and worked there. So it's only a small remnant that actually goes back. So it seems as though Ezekiel must be in some way trying to empower the people to believe that the Babylonian exile is not the end of them, that they really do have a future if they want it. And so that's why you have kind of this ramp up uh, to what is coming in chapters 40 through 48, kind of the envisioning of a new temple. That's next week. But I think what it is it's an oracle that has probably have been added even after Ezekiel in his scrolls. Most scholars think chapters 38 and 39 is a late addition. And what it is doing is it's presupposing a return from Babylon. So you might say it's a composite text of sorts, where it's kind of a creative recombination of the prophets that have come before and what Ezekiel had said to those living in exile. The thing to keep in mind, I think, that is a no miss, all right, is God represents kind of an archetype of rebellion. And you see this here as you go through. So in chapter 38, you find, if you come down to verse 10, this is what the sovereign Lord says: on that day, thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil scheme. And you will say, I will invade a land of unwalled villages, and I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, and all of them living without walls and without gates and bars. Well, that could describe pretty accurately what Jerusalem was like after the destruction of the city by the Babylonians. But the motivation is put there. I will plunder and loot and turn my hand against the resettled ruins. That's an interesting statement. Resettled ruins, okay? That the people go back. And if you remember in the book of Nehemiah, it was not an easy task. So they go in and they try to find materials to rebuild the temple. And there's opposition against them because there are people that say if they rebuild the city, if they rebuild the wall, then they're going to get strength and they'll be able to become an enemy against us in the future. So let's attack proactively before that and attack them and prevent them from rebuilding. Now, where the end time scenario comes in, it begins down in verse 14. Therefore, son of man, prophesy and say to Gog, this is what the sovereign Lord says. In that day, when my people Israel are living in safety, will you not take notice of it? Will you come from your place in the far north, you and many nations with you, all of them riding on horses, a great horde, a mighty army? So the far north, Russia, along with Iran and others that would come down and attack Israel. But as far as I know, living in the 21st century, none of them are riding horses. Okay. So if you're going to take one literally, you got to take it all literally, right? You will advance against my people, Israel, like a cloud that covers the land. In the days to come, O Gog, I will bring you against my land so that the nations may know me when I show myself holy through you before their eyes. There's that justification of God's character again coming through. So, what I think is happening here, this is my take on it. Gog is not a literal nation attacking literal Israel. It's a composite picture of all nations that can come against God's people. And there's been a long history of that in the Old Testament leading up to this time. So when you get to chapter 39, though, here's the promise. And so you can read the chapters and the verses prior to this, but let's come down to 39:1 and following. Son of man, prophesy against Gog and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I'm against you, O Gog, chief of prince of Meshach and Tubal, and I will turn you around and drag you along. I will bring you from the far north and send you against the mountains of Israel. And then I will strike your bow from your left hand and make your arrows drop from your right hand. On the mountains of Israel you will fall, you and all your troops and the nations with you. Now, those who still want to hold to a literalism might be looking at uh, the last year or more conflict between the Israelites and the Palestinians. Basically, they might turn to this and say, see, God says he'll come to the aid of his people. And basically, all of Palestine has been obliterated. It's unlivable. And what you have in the text here, look at verse 9. It says, then those who will live in the towns of Israel will go out and use the weapons for fuel and burn them up. In other words, you're going to destroy their arsenal, the small and large shields, the bows and arrows, the war clubs and spears. For 7 years, they will use them for fuel. Interesting. They will not need to gather wood from the fields or cut it from the forest because they will use the weapons for fuel. Now, what is that implying there? Well, the weapons are made of wood. Okay. These aren't tanks. You're not using that to build a campfire. And then they will plunder those who plundered them and loot those who looted them, declares the sovereign Lord. And this could really be one of those justification type verses that, see, God wants us to obliterate our enemies, and it could be a way of justifying even genocide against those who are perceived to be their enemies. Uh, jump down to verse 12. For 7 months, the house of Israel will be burying them in order to cleanse the land. There's that motivation. We're going to get rid of them once and for all. And all the people of the land will bury them. And the day I am glorified will be a memorable day for them, declares the sovereign Lord. Men will be regularly employed to cleanse the land. Some will go throughout the land, and in addition to them, others will bury those that remain on the ground. You might say, oh my gosh, is it talking about what we're observing right now? Well, you can make it say that, but again, you got to be consistent. If you're going to try to take something literal, you got to take all of it literal. And so this is ancient warfare here. It's using ancient weapons. It's using ancient mentalities, and so you can kind of do with that as you want. The thing to keep in mind here, I think, is this is deliberate prophetic exaggeration. And I think it has been added later in the book as a way of motivating those who remain and want to remain kind of the covenantal people of God, get back to that initial covenant that they had prior to their exile. So, with that, you see kind of these mental pictures in the verbiage that is used here. Now, what scholars wrestle with is a lot of the logical inconsistencies. When you read it and you say, well, that doesn't go with, and you're beginning to say, that doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm trying to read this in sequence. I'm trying to read this as if it's happening one step at a time. And that's why these two chapters will certainly frustrate you. Because I don't think that's what it's designed to do. I think this is hyperbolic, and I think the intention of it is to try to put God's glory on display. Here's that theme. It comes up again in verse 21. I will display my glory among the nations, and all the nations will see the punishment I inflict and the hand I lay upon them. And from that day forward, the house of Israel will know that I am the Lord their God, and nations will know that the people of Israel went into exile for their sin because they were unfaithful to me. And then you jump down to verse 25. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says: I will now bring Jacob back from captivity and will have compassion on all the people of Israel, and I will be zealous for my holy name. And they will forget their shame and all the unfaithfulness they showed toward me when they lived in safety in their land with no one to make them afraid. So this idea, I'm going to show myself to be a faithful God. I'm going to show myself to be holy. The nation's going to get a clear understanding of who I am as the one true God. Maybe a way to rewind is to think of Gog sort of like the way the psalmist used the concept of Pharaoh. Now, when we did the series on Sunday morning in Chaos Dragons, we talked a little bit about this Pharaoh figure showing up at various places in the Old Testament as kind of a figurative mental picture. And it occurs in the Psalms and in the prophets as well. I think Gog might be doing the same thing. And what we find is Gog is this ultimate representation of evil planning, evil desire to plunder, and evil desire to get rid of the people of God, as summarized by Ezekiel as the nation of Israel. So I think the two chapters are designed to show that God is over all the nations and that God is in control. Now, when we watch TV, sometimes we wonder whether that's true because we see the news and we go, where are you, God? And why aren't you intervening in this situation? It seems as though Ezekiel and his his brothers and sisters probably struggled with the same exact question. And maybe these two chapters are given as a source of strength and a source of hope for them to be able to believe that God really is a God of justice and that God is going to bring about a permanent deliverance and then will pour out upon them his spirit, because that's the way the chapter ends. Take a look at verse 28 and 29. Then they will know I am the Lord their God, for though I sent them into exile among the nations, I will gather them to their own land, not leaving any behind. I will no longer hide my face from them, for I will pour out my spirit on the house of Israel, declares the sovereign Lord. So in the end, God is pouring out his spirit upon them, a spirit of renewal, a spirit of hope. And I think that's where this chapter ends. It's kind of the hope that they have of coming back to their land, restoring their fortunes, restoring the temple, that type of thing. And it seems, excuse me, in verses 21 through 29, there's these themes: the restoration of fortunes, compassion that God is going to pour out, not remembering their past sins anymore, returning back to the land from exile, and finally pouring out their spirit, his spirit upon them. And then that's what leads into chapter 40, where there's this big vision, and it goes on chapter after chapter of a new temple. And it describes the east gate, and it describes the outer court, and it describes rooms for the priests, and the north gate and the south gate. And it is really redundant in chapters 40 through 48 about this temple, but we'll talk about that next week. So here's what I want to do is I want to see if you have some thoughts, some questions, and I am going to stop our recording, and I will stop our share. And tell me what you're thinking about this chapter in just some of the little things I pulled out here tonight. Do you have some thoughts or some questions that come to your mind?
Well, you know, we were kind of brought up in the GARB
Mm-hmm.
mentality. In fact, we met Jack Benemphy and Rexella
Yeah, yeah,
way back when Jenny
I knew it
was.
was Rock something. Yeah,
It's Rexella.
Rexella. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and when if we always heard Gog and Magog mentioned together, but there
Mm-hmm.
doesn't seem to be a whole lot of Magog going on.
No, if you look here, the way it begins in chapter 38, it says Gog of the land of Magog. So uh, one is a person, Gog, this figurative representative,
Right.
the land of Magog. So, yeah, but you're right. In 1970s type of eschatology, you heard a lot of Gog and Magog terminology. You see right there, that's not the way it's stated in
Right.
Ezekiel. So,
We also, when we lived in Cambridge,
mhm.
there was, I remember a roundabout.
Golf course.
It was a golf course, Gog and Magog. And then it also had Mizpah in there.
Okay.
And yeah, and my grandmother, where she lived on Lake Erie in Sheffield Lake, it was Mizpah Country Club. So I always thought that was interesting, but it was
Yeah.
just a dirt road. You know,
Uh-huh.
they paid $1 a year or something.
Yeah.
But so is Mizpah related in there somewhere or not?
Um, I'd have to look that up. I can't pull it off the top of my head.
I know it's biblical, but I can't remember where.
Yeah, and a lot of times, and it'd be interesting in understanding some of the backstory of some of these cities that use biblical names, why they did that type of thing. So I couldn't tell you without doing a little bit of research on why, you know,
Yeah.
Mizpah is an important term. I'd have to look that back up. I don't
But
remember.
I remember in England when we lived there just being horrified that these, you know, two little golf clubs or areas were Gog and Magog.
Well, again, why were those golf courses named that? I
Who
mean,
knows?
it'd be interesting. I think all cities and even countries sometimes there's some rationale behind why certain things were named for
Yeah.
that territory. But you have to do some digging into the archives to understand why. But um, this is a very controversial couple of chapters, as you know, among different Bible interpreters and stuff. And my alma maters, both Moody and Dallas, would take a very literal approach to this. Now, I think they modified some of it a little bit, but I mean, back in the 70s, boy,
Yeah.
you'll remember everything was Russia's going to invade Israel, and God's pulling them out from the north, and that's a sign that Armageddon is coming, and here we are, 50 years later. Are they troublesome nations? Absolutely. I mean, Russia's still a troublesome nation for many nations around the world, and so are some of other places, Iran and Iraq. And in the case of Israel, too, it's a troublesome nation. I mean, there is absolutely no reason that innocent Palestinians are being slaughtered. Um, but again, a lot of it is religion, and a lot of it is justifying actions. And sometimes it makes sense, and a lot of times there's ulterior motives that's producing a lot of this. And sometimes it sneaks out. Our own president, oh, that'll be a wonderful part of the world to develop real estate and really you're going to destroy a people because you want to put you know oceanfront property there. And I mean it just he he says things he doesn't realize a lot of times how well he shows his hand. you know this is this is his motivation. It's all money all the time. And it's but anyways, my point is that's always been a hot spot of the world, and it's always troublesome, and it's always among people that are really related to each other. I mean, they're brothers and sisters that go back thousands of years, and yet it's that inner family conflict that really has gotten so hostile that there's been a lot of blood that has been shed in that area of the world, and it's a shame.
What I always found interesting in the 70s and the prophecy from there was that the US was never mentioned.
Mhm.
So I always assumed we would be either taken over or annihilated or something. And nobody could, they'd always say, yeah, no, the US isn't mentioned. And then nowadays, I know people who have voted for Trump because they think he's going to bring on Armageddon.
Yeah, the far right Christian nationalism approach is suggesting, in many respects, hey, let's get on with it and get to the end of the
Mhm.
for Jesus to come. Let's get on with the end of the world, um, activities type thing. And that's a scary thing
It is.
when you think about, you know, um, gosh, when you have that mentality, making policy decisions and things like that, you go, oh boy, that religion has really led down the wrong road to the common good. That's for sure. And so, yeah, but yeah, in the 70s, it was a wonderful time, but it was a strange time because of these two influences of God was doing something inside the hearts of a lot of people during the 70s, and yet this vision of the future, a lot of times, created kind of almost a holier than thou approach to other religions and to other people who aren't Christians. And you mentioned how U.S. is never mentioned. Well, a lot of that also dovetails with, well, we're not going to be around when that happens because the rapture's going to take us because we're worthy of being raptured and taken out of the tribulation and that type of thing. It gets crazy. It gets crazy. It gets crazy in the way it becomes really uh, kind of sci-fi in the way it looks at life and stuff. But anyways, it's still around, and you still have guys and women as well that are on TV. Um, Hagee, a big proponent, John Hagee. Four blood moons, Jesus is coming, that type of thing. I mean, there's still a lot of it around. I don't think it is as dominant as it was in the 70s, but it's still there.
None of us are just in those churches anymore to hear.
Yeah, that's right. That's
Wow.
exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Some other thoughts or questions? Okay, so take it as you will, chapters 38 and 39, it's there. But I think there's some ways of looking at it that's kind of building on what came before in Ezekiel. And I think Tim Mackey in the Bible Project has some good points to make that Ezekiel is making very strong literary points through some of the imagery here. So, all right. Anything else? If not, we'll call it a night, and then we're going to finish this study next Wednesday night. So, all right. I hope you have a good rest of the
Okay.
week. Okay.
You
All
too.
right.
Okay.
Thanks,
Good
Larry.
night.
Thank
Hey,
you.
yeah,
Night.
safe travels tomorrow.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Just pray
Okay.
Casey gets a heart soon.
Yeah, we'll do.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Good night.
Night.
Night.